Hello. So today I gave a presentation at the Northeast Modern Language Association conference, and I filmed it, but the microphone on my camera did not pick up any sound. So I am representing my paper, Queering the Prince Hal Hotspur Rivalry in Abigail Thorne's The Prince. The centrality of the father-son's triad in William Shakespeare's Henry IV Part 1 lends itself extremely well to Abigail Thorne's adaptation The Prince, the play exploring the trans and gay experience through the lens of the bard. Thorne's play was initially performed at London's Southwark Playhouse in September 2022, and video of that performance as well as a making-of documentary are both available through the streaming service NeMLA. #not sponsored. The high plot of Thorne's play, which is my focus here, reworks the tensions between the three Henrys: King Henry IV, hereafter just called Henry, Prince Henry of Wales, principally called Hal, and Henry Percy, known primarily by the nickname Hotspur. In Shakespeare, Hotspur serves as the dashing, manly foil to the apparently dissolute and unprincely Prince Hal, contrast leading to Henry IV's disappointment in his son and wish that Hotspur could be his offspring. This complex triad lends itself to queering both Hal and Hotspur. Using the cultural mechanism of the closet, Thorne contrasts an openly gay Hal with Hotspur, a trans woman, played by Thorne herself in the original production run, so closeted she's not even aware that she's actually a woman until the end of the play. I argue that Thorne's progressive treatment of the Hal-Hotspur-Henry triad maps onto issues of queer shame, queer identity, and anti-LGBT prejudice, opening spaces for trans identities, representation, and creativity. To begin, The Prince's high plot follows the Shakespearean conflict in which Hal is out of favor at the royal court, and Hotspur's martial prowess makes him both a favorite of the king and so hot-headed that he leads a rebellion against Henry's reign over a slight. In Shakespeare's version, the source of Henry's disappointment in his son is Hal's wastrel joviality in taverns and petty thefts with Sir John Falstaff, a character, alas, absent from Thorne's reimagining. But in Thorne's play, Hal's effeminate homosexuality has caused the rift with his father. Hotspur, for her part, is seen by others, especially Henry, as gallant and noble, embodying the ideals of warlike manliness. While Henry rejects his gay son, he embraces the seemingly manly Hotspur, though throughout the play the social mask continually slips, with Lady Kate, Hotspur's wife, Northumberland, Hotspur's father, and even Henry himself, implying that Hotspur is female, references to which the fiery youth takes extreme offense. The lady doth protest too much, methinks. For the end of the play, the king repeats the wish that Hotspur could be his child, but this scene ends with Henry embracing Hal, recognizing that the rejection has been his own short-sightedness, not based in any fault of his son's. Alongside this high plot is a more postmodern low plot, following two characters, Sam and Jen, both modern trans women who've been sucked into the world of Henry IV Part 1 and need to navigate their way through a strangely mechanized theater universe in order to return to the present day. Prince wraps up with all of the characters transported to modern-day Brighton, where Hotspur is openly living as a trans woman, Hal is a stylish gay man, according to the stage directions, and Henry is apparently now reconciled to both Hal and Hotspur's LGBT identities. Much of the tension in Thorne's The Prince is driven by antipathy to LGBT identities, both externalized and internalized. King Henry and Northumberland, the fathers of Hal and Hotspur respectively, and played by a single actor in a doubled role, give voice to homophobia and transphobia, often rooted in the anxieties of an older generation confused by changes to sexual and gender mores, or dealt with sympathetically in the form of parental fears about losing the child they know when a child comes out as trans. In both guises, Henry and Northumberland, the actor gives voice to these anxieties. One of the most overt instances comes in the revision to Henry's famous speech envying Northumberland's paternity of Hotspur. In the Shakespeare, Yea, there thou makest me sad, and makest me sin and envy, that my lord Northumberland should be the father to so blessed a son who is the theme of honour's tongue, amongst a grove the very straightest plant, who is sweet fortune's minion and her pride, whilst I, by looking on the praise of him, see riot and disorder stain the brow of my young Harry. Oh, that it could be proved that some night-tripping fairy had exchanged in cradle-clothes our children where they lay, and called mine Percy, his Plantagenet. Then would I have his Harry, and he mine. In this speech, Henry is purely selfish, wishing that his own Harry, Prince Hal, were a better reflection on him as a father, becoming the theme of honour's tongue, as young Hotspur is. However, in Thorne's reworking, Henry's jealousy is tempered, no longer pure selfishness, but blended with worry over the negative socio-cultural consequences Hal is likely to face given his homosexuality. The speech starts on familiar ground, but quickly makes an important change. Yea, there thou makest me sad, and makest me sin, in envy that my lord Northumberland should be the father of so blessed a child, a daughter, who is the theme of honour's tongue. The reference to Hotspur as a daughter, rather than the Shakespearean son, is the culmination of a series of slips in which other characters recognize Hotspur as trans, even as she fails to see this truth about herself. This moment is also striking because Hotspur is on stage and hears how Henry genders her, and it's the first time in the play Hotspur does not protest her maleness. As Hal arrives on the stage, Henry goes on, "Whilst I, by looking on that praise, see riot and dishonour stain the brow of my young worry." I mean Harry. I worry. I don't want him to miss out on everything I've put aside for him. The Freudian slip "worry" for Harry marks a change from poetry to prose, from Shakespeare's verse to the more modern register of prose dialogue, aligning linguistically with the more contemporary anxiety expressed by a parent concerned about the negative experiences an LGBT child will likely face in a homophobic and transphobic society. The same actor playing Henry gives voice to comparable fears in his other role as Northumberland, making a heart-wrenching speech, which I will not read in full in the interests of time, although in the panel today our fourth speaker wasn't there, so I could have included it, but I didn't type it out. But Northumberland makes a heart-wrenching speech to Hotspur in which he describes a parental dread of a shameful child. He tells Hotspur that a shameful child is worse than a dead child, because the living child reminds a parent ever of the shame until the parent comes to wish their child dead. Northumberland specifically, though subtly, ties his pride in Hotspur to the child's gender identity, saying, "I thank God for thee, Harry. I am proud to say thou art my son." Northumberland's pride is therefore specifically tied to Hotspur's sonness, the quality of him being a son, with all the masculine characteristics this entails. It's little wonder, then, that Hotspur consistently reacts violently and with disgust whenever any character, until the penultimate scene with Henry's speech discussed a moment ago, links her with femininity. Hotspur's first lines in 1-1 of The Prince reveal her investment in masculinity. "On your feet, Prince Hal, these wars make men of us. Are you a man?" When Hal replies that he's exhausted, Hotspur dismisses him in disgust. "Then get thee to thy tent, I say, go to. We have no use for women on the field." Later, in conversation with Northumberland, Hotspur defends her manliness against even the mildest association with femininity. Northumberland remarks, "Why, what a wasp-stung and impatient fool art thou to break into this woman's mood?" And Hotspur responds, "A woman's mood? What are you talking about? Do I seem womanly to you? My moods are male." The irony, of course, should not be lost that in the Southwark Playhouse production, Hotspur was played by Abigail Thorne, a trans woman, and so the denial of Hotspur's femininity is double-coded on the actor's body, which itself risks being misgendered. Hotspur consistently reacts with aversion to references to her femininity, remaining deeply in the closet in ways that align with societal expectations for cisgendered people and Northumberland's stated expectations for his son. Hal similarly experiences shame, or probably more properly guilt for being gay, which for him is justifiably externalized onto his father. It's not clear that Hal experiences his sexuality as a source of shame, but he is keenly aware of his father's disgust. In a parody of the Shakespearean scene where Hal and Falstaff mock an interview between the king and his son, Thorne's Hal plays both sides of a conversation between his father and Hotspur. Parody begins with Hotspur bragging about his military conquests and Henry and Northumberland gushing over the younger man's very sexy wife. While the opening of Hal's faux conversation seems driven by rage and resentment, by the end it has collapsed into a moment of deep shame. As Hotspur, Hal says, "Oh, King Henry, your son is a..." slight. He has clean fingernails and he combs his hair and he does not have a very sexy wife. He knows nothing of the pussy. He is unquestionably a, further slight, of the most heinous disposition. Take me as your son instead. And Hal's King Henry responds, "Yes, that is absolutely a sensible reaction to my son's homosexuality and not at all likely to scar him for life. I am an extremely good father." Parodic performances of homophobia have a long history in queer spaces as a cathartic purging of shame and suffering linked to oppression. As Eve Sedgwick writes in Shame, Theatricality, and Queer Performativity is the name of a strategy for the production of meaning and being in relation to the affect shame and to the later and related fact of stigma. Hal externalizes his suffering, his guilt, which is linked to Henry's inability or unwillingness to accept his son as he is. But Thorne's play ultimately is not content with that refusal of acceptance. As a trans artist herself, Thorne's work commits to opening spaces for LGBT representation, both within the cultural or literary space of the play and within the physical and social space of a major London theatre. In the space of the play, the final scene and transition to it evoke an acceptance, however slow and tenuous, of Hal and Hotspur for their true selves. While Hal spends the play aware of his own homosexuality, it's only in the final scene, set in contemporary Brighton, that Hotspur is able to accept herself. According to the stage directions, enter Hotspur, now in modern clothes as a trans woman. For a character played by Thorne herself, this entrance as a modern trans woman meta-theatrically aligns the character with the actor's identity, even as it's an embrace of Hotspur's own true self. It's notable that this is virtually the first time in the play when Hotspur shows any degree of empathy, sympathy, or concern for anyone else. Elsewhere, like Shakespeare's hot-headed and militaristic Hotspur, Thorne's Hotspur has been driven by anger, a desire for violence, and an unwillingness to consider those around her. But in 2-8, the final scene of the play, the embrace of her true identity seems to bring her peace and inner harmony, which, without reading too much into the author's biography, seems to coincide with Thorne's own experience of transition, as documented in videos like Identity, a Trans Coming Out Story, and Social Construct, or What is a Woman Really, on her Philosophy Tube YouTube channel. And if you don't already follow Philosophy Tube, I highly recommend it. But, of course, the transition to modernity and Hal and Hotspur's out-LGBT identities is not simplistic. As Hotspur reflects, it's hard to get used to playing a new role, as it were. And naturally, issues of anti-LGBT prejudice are also intimately connected to family and the cycles of shame that often build through familial rejection. Henry and Northumberland's shift to acceptance is not overtly dramatized, but it is incorporated into the end of The Prince. In the final moments of 2-7, the last scene set in Shakespeare's medieval world, Henry repeats and then breaks from those fateful lines. "Oh, that it could be proved that some night-tripping fairy had changed Northumberland's child with mine when they were born, then would I have his Harry and he mine." Wait, I don't mean that. And he goes to Prince Hal and hugs him. "My boy, I don't mean that." Prince Hal asks, "Are you Northumberland or King Henry?" And Henry responds, I'm Dad." The exact basis of Henry or Northumberland's reassessment isn't clear, but Hotspur does confirm in the final scene that Dad took a while to come round, but he got there in the end. The happy ending of this play is inherently entangled with layers of acceptance, both self-acceptance on the parts of Hotspur and Hal, and acceptance by the twinned Henry Northumberland paternal figure. But the performance of the play itself functions alongside this thematic of acceptance to promote an embrace of LGBT people. Representations of trans people on the stage, especially representations not built entirely around trauma, remain rare, and plays authored by trans playwrights are definitely a minority. The Methuen Drama Book of Trans Plays is a great starting resource for anyone interested in more theater by and about the trans experience. Positive, and perhaps more importantly, complex depictions of trans people throughout media is an important step toward building acceptance of and support for trans people. Thorne has been an advocate for trans rights, the normalization of trans visibility within society, and access to gender-affirming care. For instance, see her Philosophy Tube video, I emailed my doctor 133 times, the crisis in the British healthcare system, which describes her own struggles accessing gender-affirming care as a relatively famous white British person, and delves into how much more difficult such care can be for people of color, impoverished people, and so on. One might, unfortunately, also add Americans under the new administration to groups who have an extremely difficult time accessing necessary gender-affirming health care. But as we've seen, mass media and prominent representations of groups like gays and lesbians have helped normalize those identities for increasingly wider swaths of society, paralleling rises in support for gay and lesbian rights and protections. In this sense, a play by a trans author featuring trans characters and actors being performed at a major London theatre certainly contributes to a project of increasing visibility, acceptance, and social justice for LGBT people and communities. Thank you.